There's a particular kind of silence that falls over old cities at night, the kind that carries memory in it, like smoke caught in stone walls. And if you were to stand tonight in the ruins of a great German estate, with the wind moving slow through iron gates and the moon casting long shadows across empty courtyards, you might feel it. A weight, a presence, the echo of something enormous that once moved through this world and left its mark on nearly everything. This is the story of a family, a name, a dynasty so deeply woven into the fabric of history that you cannot fully understand the wars of the modern world without first understanding them. They built the cannons that shook the earth at Waterloo. They forged the steel that held the railroads of a rising empire together. And they handed Adolf Hitler the instruments of destruction that made the Holocaust and the Second World War not just possible, but mechanically, industrially efficient. Their name was Krupp. And tonight, we are going to walk gently through their world, through the smoke and the steel, through the grand halls and the slave labor camps, through the rise, the ruin, and the long, complicated silence that followed. We are going to let history breathe around us like a quiet room, and we are going to understand, perhaps for the first time, just how ordinary the beginning of something terrible can look. So settle in now. Let your body find its rest. Let the weight of the day begin to lift, and let this story carry you somewhere real, somewhere deep, somewhere worth remembering. Before we begin, a quiet word. If you find that these stories have a way of easing you towards sleep, if the cadence of history told softly is something your nights have needed, then let this channel be the one that stays beside you. A subscribe costs nothing. A notification bell asks very little, but together they mean that the next time the night feels long, we will already be here, waiting with another story, another world, another whisper across time. Now, let us begin. There is something about the way firelight moves across the face of a dreaming man that tells you everything. It flickers, it reaches, it refuses to be still. And in the early years of the 19th century, in a small and struggling city on the western edge of Germany, there was a man whose face always looked like that, always lit from within by something restless, something reaching, something that could not quite find its rest. His name was Friedrich Krupp, and he had a dream that would outlive him by 2 centuries. Essen, in those years, was not the great industrial city it would one day become. It was modest, quiet in the way that places are quiet when they are waiting for something, when the story has not quite begun yet, when the stage is set but the curtain has not moved. The streets were narrow, and the winters were long, and the people who lived there were the kind of people who understood work the way they understood breathing. It was simply what you did. It was how you survived. Friedrich Krupp arrived into this world carrying the particular burden of a man with vision and insufficient means. He came from a family of merchants, people who understood trade and commerce, people who could read the shape of an opportunity even when it was wrapped in uncertainty. And the opportunity that Friedrich saw, the one that kept him awake long after the candles had burned low, was steel, specifically the kind of steel the English made, cast steel, hard, precise, extraordinary steel that could be shaped into tools and blades and machinery parts with a consistency that the German foundries of his time simply could not match. The English had the secret, and Friedrich wanted it. He was not, by most accounts, a man of exceptional technical genius. What he had was hunger, the particular, restless hunger of someone who believes, who genuinely, deeply believes, that the thing they are reaching for is just slightly beyond their fingertips. Not impossible, never impossible. Just a little further. Just one more attempt, just one more formula, one more furnace temperature, one more combination of materials laid into the crucible with trembling, hopeful hands. He built a small factory in Essen in 1811. He poured into it everything the family had, and then everything they could borrow, and then everything they could promise. He hired workers, he ran experiments, he failed, and he adjusted, and he failed again, and he adjusted again, and the years moved over him the way years do when you are too consumed by a single purpose to notice their passing. The English secret remained a secret. By the time Friedrich Krupp died in 1826, the factory was producing almost nothing of value. The family was deep in debt, the workers had mostly gone, the furnaces were cold more often than they burned, and the dream, that luminous, flickering dream of a German steel empire, seemed to have died with him, quietly and without ceremony, in a city that was still waiting to become something. He left behind a wife, he left behind debt, and he left behind a 14-year-old boy named Alfred, who had watched his father's dream fail with the steady, serious eyes of a child who had already decided that failure is a lesson, not an ending. What happened next was not a miracle. Miracles happen quickly, in a flash of sudden light. What happened with Alfred Krupp was slower and stranger, and ultimately more extraordinary than any miracle. It was the long, grinding, obsessive transformation of a broken inheritance into an empire. It was a boy deciding, in the particular silence that follows grief, that his father's dream was not finished. It was just his turn to carry it. And so the story does not end in 1826 in a cold foundry in Essen. It begins there. Alfred Krupp was 14 years old when he became the head of a failing business, a fatherless household, and a dream that had so far cost his family everything. Most boys his age were learning to read maps, playing in the fields outside town, worrying about small things the way children are supposed to worry about small things. Alfred was learning the temperature at which steel becomes something other than metal. He was learning to read a furnace the way a musician reads a score, feeling for nuance, for the subtle shift in color and heat that separates a good pour from a ruined one. He had very little formal education. What he had instead was something rarer and in many ways more powerful, an almost frightening capacity for work and a quality of attention that bordered on obsession. He could focus on a single problem for hours, days, weeks with a concentration so complete that the world outside the factory walls seemed to barely exist for him. Food was a distraction, sleep was a concession, rest was something other people needed. This was not entirely healthy. Alfred Krupp, across the whole long arc of his life, would be a difficult man, controlling, paranoid, prone to profound loneliness despite being surrounded by thousands of workers who depended on him. He wrote long, rambling memos to his staff about everything from the proper way to address him to the appropriate behavior of employees in their private lives. He was, in the language of a later age, a man with an extraordinary gift and an equally extraordinary set of wounds. But in those early years, with the factory barely breathing and the family name carrying more debt than dignity, what Alfred's peculiar intensity produced was not dysfunction. It produced steel.
It did not happen overnight. Nothing real ever does. The kind of transformation that Alfred Krupp was engineering, quietly, methodically, in a foundry that most of Essen had already written off as a lost cause, was the kind that happens in small increments, almost invisibly, the way a river slowly carves a canyon. You would not have noticed the change from 1 week to the next, but look away for a year, and suddenly the landscape is different. By the early 1830s, Alfred had done what his father could not. He had cracked the secret of cast steel. Not stolen it, not bought it, worked it out through years of experiment and failure and the particular stubborn intelligence of a man who simply refuses to accept that something is beyond him. The steel that came out of the Krupp foundry now had a quality to it, a consistency, a precision that made people pay attention. Toolmakers noticed, craftsmen noticed, and slowly, cautiously, orders began to come in. The early products were humble: rolls for flattening precious metals, dies for minting coins, small, precise instruments for industries that required exactly the kind of reliable, high-quality steel that Alfred was now producing. These were not the products of legend. They were the quiet, unglamorous foundation of everything that came after, the proof that the dream was not dead, that the furnace could produce something worth selling, that the name Krupp might mean something after all. Alfred took those early earnings and put them straight back into the factory. New equipment, better furnaces, more workers. He moved through the business with the intensity of a man who understands in his bones that momentum is everything, that the moment you stop pushing forward is the moment the ground begins to shift beneath you. He traveled, too. He went to England, to the great industrial heartland that had haunted his father's imagination, and he studied what he saw there with the focused, hungry eyes of a student who knows he is looking at the future. He went to other European countries, meeting manufacturers and merchants and engineers, building a network of contacts and a library of knowledge that he carried back to Essen and fed directly into the growing machine of the Krupp enterprise. He was selling himself as much as he was selling steel. Alfred Krupp understood, with an instinct that seemed almost modern, that reputation was a form of capital, that the story of a young German boy who had inherited nothing but debt and transformed it through sheer force of will into something extraordinary, that story was worth something. It attracted customers, it attracted investors, it attracted the kind of attention that a small foundry in a provincial German city desperately needed if it was going to compete on a European stage. And all through these years of building and traveling and selling and experimenting, the weapons were there. Not dominant yet, not the heart of the business, but present, the way a shadow is present on a bright day, easy to ignore, always there. Alfred made his first steel cannon in 1847. It was a demonstration piece, really, a proof of concept, a way of showing the world that Krupp steel was strong enough, precise enough, reliable enough to be trusted with the most demanding application a metal could face. He exhibited it at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, that magnificent Victorian showcase of industrial progress, and the cannon sat there among the marvels of the age, gleaming, precise, enormous, and people stopped and stared. The Prussian military was not immediately interested. Armies are conservative institutions by nature, slow to trust new things, attached to the materials and methods they already understand. The cannon that Alfred Krupp displayed in London was received with polite curiosity and then largely set aside. It would take time and the violent, clarifying argument of actual battlefield performance before the military establishment fully understood what it was looking at. But Alfred was patient. Patient in the way that obsessive people can be patient, not calm, not relaxed, but capable of sustaining a long campaign toward a single goal with a focus that doesn't waver even when the results are slow. He kept making guns. He kept improving them. He kept finding ways to demonstrate their superiority over the cast iron and bronze artillery that armies had relied on for centuries. And he kept talking to anyone in a position of military or political power who would listen. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived on the back of history's oldest argument for new technology: war. The wars of German unification in the 1860s and early 1870s, Bismarck's calculated surgical conflicts against Denmark, Austria, and finally France, became, among other things, a brutal demonstration of what Krupp steel could do. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was perhaps the most vivid demonstration of all. French armies, equipped with what they believed to be superior artillery, found themselves on the wrong end of a technological revolution. Krupp guns outranged them, outperformed them, and tore through their formations with a precision and power that left military observers across the world shaken and reassessing everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. Prussia won. Germany unified, and Alfred Krupp became almost overnight the most famous arms manufacturer in the world. Orders came from everywhere, from Russia, from Turkey, from Britain's rivals and Britain's allies alike, from nations that barely knew each other's names but all understood now that if you wanted the best artillery in the world, there was only one address. Alfred moved through this period of extraordinary success with the complicated emotions of a man who has wanted something for so long that its arrival doesn't quite feel the way he imagined it would. The factory grew, the workforce grew. The estate that he built for himself, Villa Hule, a vast and somewhat joyless mansion on a hill above Essen, grew too, spreading across the landscape with the particular extravagance of a man who is not sure that beauty is something he actually knows how to enjoy.
He filled Villa Hule with art and furniture and all the markers of civilization and culture. He moved through the enormous rooms with the slightly lost air of a man more comfortable in a foundry than a drawing room. He had a wife, Bertha, whom he met and married in 1853, and with whom he had one son, Friedrich Alfred, who would one day inherit everything. But the marriage was difficult. Alfred's obsessions consumed him. His need for control extended from the factory floor into his personal life, into his household, into his correspondence with his wife, which was voluminous and frequently exhausting. He was, in the end, a man who had given everything to a dream and found that the dream, once achieved, could not give everything back. The factory could. The factory always could. Right up until the end of his life, he died in 1887 at the age of 75, Alfred found in the furnaces and the rolling mills and the endless satisfying problem of making better steel a peace that he could not quite locate anywhere else. He walked the factory floors with his workers in a way that surprised people who expected a man of his wealth and power to be remote and untouchable. He knew their names. He knew the particular challenges of their work. He had, after all, done that work himself, as a boy of 14 in a cold foundry with no workers at all, just the dream his father had left him and the stubborn refusal to let it die. And so, as the long evening of Alfred Krupp's life settled gently into night, he left behind something that was, by any measure, extraordinary. A factory that employed tens of thousands of people, a name that was synonymous across the whole world with precision and power. A dynasty that his son would inherit and his granddaughter would lend her name to. Her name was Bertha, just like his wife, and one day a very large gun would carry it into the history books in a way that neither of them could imagine. He left behind an empire built on fire and will and the particular loneliness of men who dream too large for any room to contain them. And the world he left it to was already changing, already moving towards something darker, already preparing, in ways that no one fully understood yet, for the century of fire that was coming. The furnaces stayed lit. They always stayed lit. And somewhere in the long, soft corridors of Villa Hule, in the silence that follows the end of a great man's story, the next chapter was already beginning to write itself.
There is a particular kind of inheritance that arrives not as a gift, but as a weight. Not the comfortable weight of something warm and familiar, but the cold, dense weight of something enormous. Something that has been growing for decades before you arrived. Something that has already decided what it is and what it needs from you. Something that watches you with the patient eyes of a thing that has already outlasted one man and is quietly deciding whether it will outlast you too. Friedrich Alfred Krupp, Fritz, as those closest to him called him, though there were few who were truly close, stepped into that inheritance in 1887. He was 30 years old. He had grown up in the shadow of a father whose intensity had filled every room he ever entered, whose will had bent the world around him like heat bends light, whose name had become something larger than a name. Alfred Krupp had not simply been a man, he had been a force. And now the force had gone, and the sun stood in its absence, and the factory waited. Fritz was not his father. This is the first and perhaps most important thing to understand about him. Where Alfred had been angular and driven and difficult, Fritz was softer, more social, more genuinely warm, more interested in people as people rather than as instruments of production. He had his father's intelligence, but not his father's ferocity. He had the family's gift for understanding industry without the consuming obsession that had made Alfred simultaneously great and deeply unhappy. In another life, in a smaller story, Fritz Krupp might have been a naturalist. He was genuinely passionate about marine biology. He funded research expeditions to the Mediterranean. He had a villa built on the island of Capri where he could study the ocean life he found so endlessly fascinating. He corresponded with scientists with the enthusiastic engagement of a man who has found something that makes the world feel full of wonder. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the heir to the world's greatest weapons empire was, at heart, a man who would rather have been watching the movement of sea creatures through clear water than overseeing the production of artillery shells.
But the empire needed him, and Fritz, whatever his personal inclinations, understood duty the way that people understand gravity, not as a choice, but as a condition of existence. The Germany that Fritz Krupp inherited the business into was not the Germany his father had grown up in. It was a unified nation now, young, ambitious, burning with the particular energy of a country that has recently discovered its own power and is not entirely sure what to do with it. The Kaiser sat on his throne in Berlin, and around him the great machinery of a modernizing state was moving faster and faster, consuming coal and steel and human labor at a rate that would have stunned the previous generation. The railroads were spreading like rivers across the landscape, connecting cities and industries and markets in ways that were transforming the daily texture of German life, and Krupp steel was in all of it. This is the chapter of the Krupp story that is easiest to feel proud of in a complicated way. The weapons were there. They were always there. But in the years of Fritz's leadership, the empire's reach extended so far beyond armaments that it was genuinely possible to see Krupp as something other than a war machine. Krupp steel was in the bridges that carried trains over German rivers. It was in the axles and wheels of locomotives that moved goods and people from one end of the country to the other. It was in the infrastructure of a civilization that was, by any honest measure, advancing, becoming more connected, becoming more capable of sustaining and improving human life. There is something worth pausing over here, in the soft quiet of this late hour, because this is one of history's most persistent and most uncomfortable lessons, that the same material, the same technology, the same human genius that builds the bridge also builds the cannon, that the knowledge which connects people can also destroy them, that progress and devastation are not opposites. They are, far too often, the same river flowing in two directions at once. Fritz Krupp expanded the workforce to numbers his father could only have dreamed of. By the turn of the century, Krupp was employing tens of thousands of workers in Essen alone, and the company had developed around them something that looked, in certain lights, almost utopian. Krupp housing estates provided workers with homes at subsidized rents. Krupp hospitals treated their illnesses. Krupp schools educated their children. There were pension funds, consumer cooperatives, recreational facilities, a whole parallel society built around the factory designed to ensure that the men and women who fed the furnaces were healthy enough, housed enough, stable enough to keep feeding them. It would be too simple to call this generosity. It was also strategy, a way of binding workers to the company, of reducing labor unrest, of ensuring a reliable and grateful workforce in an era when socialism and labor organizing were spreading across Europe with a speed that made industrialists very nervous. Alfred had been paternalistic in the same way, deeply concerned with his workers' well-being in a manner that was simultaneously genuine and self-serving, caring and controlling. But whatever the motivation, the effect was real. The Krupp workers' colony in Essen was, by the standards of its time, remarkable. People had roofs over their heads, food in their children's stomachs, doctors when they were sick. In an age when industrial labor could mean genuine destitution, this was not nothing. It was, in its complicated way, something. And all of it, the housing and the hospitals and the schools and the pensions, was paid for by steel, by rails and axles and springs, and yes, by guns. Always by guns.
The world at the turn of the 20th century had a particular quality to it that is difficult to describe without reaching for the language of dreams. Not peaceful dreams, something more unsettled than that. The kind of dream where everything looks normal on the surface, where the light seems right and the streets are familiar. But somewhere underneath there is a low, persistent hum of wrongness that you cannot quite locate or name. Europe in 1900 was prosperous and cultured and deeply, structurally dangerous. The great powers, Germany, Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Russia, were bound together by trade and separated by ambition, connected by railroads and divided by the slow accumulation of grievances and alliances that were quietly making a catastrophic war not just possible, but, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Fritz Krupp did not live to see that war. His story ended earlier and more privately, and in a way that the family and the newspapers of the time handled with the particular Victorian delicacy that meant speaking around something rather than about it.
In 1902, a Hamburg newspaper published a story about Fritz Krupp's activities on the island of Capri. The story alleged relationships with young Italian men, a scandal of the kind that, in the moral climate of Wilhelmine Germany, was not merely embarrassing but potentially criminal. The Kaiser himself expressed his support for Fritz publicly, insisting on his innocence, attempting to contain the damage. But the damage could not be contained. Whether from the weight of the public humiliation or from some other cause that history has not fully clarified, Fritz Krupp died just days after the story broke. He was 48 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as a stroke, but the circumstances have never stopped feeling like something more complicated than that. He left behind a wife, Margareta, and 2 daughters, and he left behind an empire of extraordinary size and power that now needed urgently to figure out what happened next. What happened next was Bertha. Bertha Krupp was 19 years old when her father died. She was quiet and serious and had grown up inside the great shadow of the Krupp name with the self-possession of someone who has always understood, at some level, that their life is not entirely their own, that they are part of a story larger than any individual chapter. She was not, by the customs of her time, expected to run the business herself. Women of her class and era were expected to marry well and to transfer the responsibilities of management to the man they married. But who she married mattered enormously, because whoever married Bertha Krupp would become, in effect, the custodian of the most powerful industrial enterprise in Germany. The Kaiser took a personal interest in the selection. Wilhelm II had always had a complicated relationship with the Krupp Dynasty, admiring it, depending on it, occasionally visiting Villa Hugel with the slightly proprietary air of a man who considers himself a patron of something he does not quite own. He approved the match between Bertha and Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach, a diplomat of good family and steady temperament, who took the Krupp name upon marriage and became Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, a name so long and layered that it seemed to carry the weight of 2 dynasties at once.
Gustav was not a man of industrial genius. He was an administrator, careful, methodical, deeply conservative in his instincts, the kind of man who understood systems and hierarchies and the proper ordering of things with a clarity that made him very good at managing something that already existed and very unlikely to transform it into something new. He brought to the Krupp Empire the qualities of a steady hand rather than a visionary mind, and in the particular circumstances of the early 20th century, a steady hand was perhaps exactly what was needed. Under Gustav's management, the empire continued to grow. The weapons division deepened and expanded, responding to the accelerating arms race that was consuming European military budgets with an appetite that seemed to grow larger the more it was fed. Germany was building a navy to rival Britain's. Its army was expanding and modernizing. The strategic calculations of the great powers were growing more elaborate and more frightening with every passing year. And through all of it, the Krupp factories worked on, filling orders, refining designs, pushing the technology of destruction forward with the same methodical precision that Alfred had brought to the making of steel tools half a century before. There is something almost meditative about the way these years unfold when you look at them from a quiet distance, the machinery of history moving forward with such terrible momentum, the individuals inside it, Gustav, Bertha, the engineers and managers and workers, all doing what the situation seemed to require, all following the logic of their position, none of them fully able to see the shape of what they were collectively building. This is one of the things that history asks us to sit with in the soft hours of the night, when the mind is open and the defenses are down. Not the monsters, not the obvious villains with their obvious evil, but the ordinary logic of ordinary people inside extraordinary systems, following the steps they have been given, building something they cannot yet see whole. The arms race of the early 20th century was not driven by hatred alone. It was driven by fear, by competition, by the strange mathematics of deterrence, the belief, sincerely held by serious people, that the best way to prevent war was to be so thoroughly prepared for it that no rational enemy would dare begin one. The Krupp factories were, in the minds of the men who ran them, instruments of peace as much as instruments of war. The guns they built were, in theory, guns that would never need to be fired,
because their very existence would make any enemy think twice. History, of course, had other ideas. In the summer of 1914, the thing that everyone had been preparing for and no one had quite believed would actually happen, happened. A single gunshot in Sarajevo, a young man with a pistol and a cause, a wrong turn taken by an archduke's driver on a summer morning, and the whole elaborate structure of European alliances shuddered and began to move. Germany declared war, then France, then Britain, then the others, one by one, like dominoes falling in a room where someone has finally, after years of careful arrangement, knocked the first one over. The Krupp factories did not pause to reflect on any of this. The furnaces burned brighter, the shifts grew longer, the orders multiplied, and deep in the rolling mills of Essen, in the heat and the noise and the particular smell of metal under enormous pressure, the great Krupp machine shifted from the production of peace into the production of war with a smoothness and efficiency that was, depending on your perspective, a marvel of industrial organization, or the most terrible thing you had ever seen. Gustav Krupp stood at the center of it all, steady, methodical, correct, and watched the empire his wife had inherited and he had tended grow into something that even Alfred, in his most ambitious moments, might not have imagined. The war needed everything, and Krupp would provide it. The shadow that had always been there, running quietly beneath the gleam of the rails and the pride of the bridges and the careful architecture of the workers' colonies, that shadow was about to step into the full, terrible light, and the world would never look quite the same again.
There is a sound that people who lived near the Krupp factories in Essen during the First World War described in their letters and diaries with a kind of exhausted reverence. It was not a single sound, but a layering of sounds. The deep, rhythmic percussion of the great hammers, the hiss of steam, the low, constant roar of furnaces that never cooled, the distant clang of metal on metal that seemed to come from everywhere at once and from nowhere in particular, as though the earth itself were working. They wrote about it the way people write about weather, as something that surrounded them completely, something they had stopped choosing and simply lived inside. The sound of Essen at war was the sound of a civilization consuming itself to survive, or at least believing that it was surviving, which in the early years of the war amounted to very nearly the same thing. The First World War arrived in August of 1914 with a kind of terrible enthusiasm that is almost impossible to understand from the quiet distance of more than a century. The men who marched in those first weeks, German men, French men, British men, Austrian men, marched with flowers in their rifle barrels and songs on their lips, and the genuine, astonishing belief that it would be over by Christmas. That war, at this level of civilizational sophistication, at this peak of European culture and technology and progress, could not possibly last long. That the sheer weight of modern industrial power brought to bear on a military conflict would resolve things quickly, decisively, and then everyone could go home. What they had not fully understood, what almost no one had fully understood, was that the same industrial power that they believed would end the war quickly was precisely what would make it endless. The machine gun, the artillery piece, the railroad that could move reinforcements to any threatened point faster than any attacking force could exploit a breakthrough, the industrial capacity to produce shells and guns and barbed wire and poison gas in quantities that previous centuries would have considered literally impossible. All of these things, the products of the great modernizing surge of the 19th century, combined on the Western Front to produce something that had no real precedent in human history, a war that could not be won by movement, only endured through mass, through numbers, through the willingness to feed human lives into the machinery of attrition until one side simply ran out. And at the center of the German side of that machinery, providing the guns, the shells, the steel that held the whole terrible structure together, was Krupp. Gustav Krupp had prepared for this with the careful, methodical thoroughness that defined everything he did.
In the years before the war, he had quietly expanded Krupp's production capacity, modernized its equipment, deepened its relationship with the German military establishment. He had done this not out of warmongering. Gustav was not, by nature or inclination, a man who wanted war, but out of the same institutional logic that had always driven the Krupp enterprise. The military needed weapons. Krupp made weapons. The relationship was symbiotic, mutually sustaining, and deeply structurally resistant to any moral examination of what it was ultimately for. When the war began, the factories shifted into their wartime configuration with a speed that surprised even those who had planned for it. Within weeks, the Essen complex was running around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week, the furnaces never going cold, the rolling mills never going quiet. Workers who had been making railroad components found themselves making shell casings. Engineers who had been designing bridge supports found themselves working on artillery carriages. The entire vast organism of the Krupp enterprise turned like a great ship changing course towards the single consuming purpose of feeding a war. And the numbers that emerged from this effort are the kind that resist easy comprehension. By the middle years of the war, Krupp was producing tens of thousands of artillery shells every single day. The factory complex in Essen had grown to cover an area larger than many European towns, with its own internal railroad network, its own power generation, its own hospitals and canteens and administrative systems. It was, in the most literal sense, a city within a city whose entire purpose and economy and reason for existence was the production of the instruments of mass death. And the workers who filled this city were, in those early years, German workers. Men and women from Essen and the surrounding Ruhr Valley, people who had grown up in the shadow of the Krupp chimneys, who had gone to Krupp schools and been treated in Krupp hospitals and lived in Krupp houses. People for whom the factory was not an abstraction, but the texture of daily life, the source of their wages and their identity and their community. They worked the long shifts with the particular grim endurance of people who understand that there is no alternative, that the war has made the factory into a kind of destiny, and that the only thing to do with a destiny is to meet it as steadily as you can. And Gustav moved through the factory in those years with the careful, observant eye of a man who understood administration deeply and human suffering only partially. He was not cruel. He was not indifferent in the way that suggests active contempt. He was perhaps most accurately described as enclosed, a man whose emotional architecture had been built for the management of systems rather than the feeling of lives, who could look at a production report with genuine engagement and look at an exhausted worker with genuine incomprehension of what he was really seeing. This enclosure, this quality of seeing the factory whole and its people only partially, would become, as the war ground on and the labor supply grew desperate, something more than a personal failing. It would become a structural condition that made certain decisions not just possible, but within the logic of the institution, almost inevitable. But that darkness was still gathering in the middle distance. In the early years of the war, the story of Krupp was still primarily the story of extraordinary industrial power applied to military purpose. Brutal and consuming, certainly, but operating within the boundaries of what the century understood as the normal, terrible mathematics of war. And then came Big Bertha.
She was not named for beauty. She was named for weight, for the sheer, almost incomprehensible physical fact of her existence. Big Bertha, the siege howitzer that Krupp engineers had been developing in the years before the war, with the quiet, focused intensity of people who understand they are building something the world has never seen, was a gun that existed at the outer edge of what industrial civilization could produce and what the human mind could fully absorb. She weighed nearly 50 tons. Her barrel alone was over 3 meters long. The shell she fired, a projectile of almost 1,000 kilograms, traveled in a great, slow arc through the sky and arrived at its target with a force that did not merely destroy what it hit, but seemed to erase it, to return it to a condition before structure, before architecture. before the human impulse to build things that last. She was named with a mixture of affection and dark humor that says something about the psychology of the men who built her after Bertha Krupp, the quiet, serious young woman who had inherited the empire and who was now, in the strange way of these things, lending her name to the most destructive weapon her family had ever produced. Bertha herself, by all accounts, was not entirely pleased about this. The military situation that brought Big Bertha into history was the German army's need to move quickly through Belgium in the opening weeks of the war, a movement that the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's grand strategic design for a two-front war, absolutely depended upon. The Belgian fortresses that stood in the way of this movement were, by the standards of conventional artillery, effectively impregnable. They had been built with the latest engineering knowledge, their walls thick enough and their positions deep enough to absorb the punishment of ordinary guns and continue functioning. The German advance needed them removed, quickly, before the French could mobilize, before the British could intervene, before the window of strategic opportunity that the Schlieffen Plan required could close. Big Bertha removed them. The fortress of Liège, which military strategists had estimated could hold out for months against a conventional siege, fell in days. The great guns, Krupp had produced several of the massive howitzers, and Austria-Hungary had a similar weapon, fired their enormous shells in a high, almost lazy arc, the projectiles visible for a moment against the sky, before they descended with a sound that survivors described as something between a freight train and the end of the world. The concrete and steel of the Belgian fortifications, built to withstand anything that 19th century artillery could deliver, simply could not absorb what the 20th century had sent against them. The military world watched and recalibrated everything it thought it knew. Across Europe, in the general staffs and war ministries of every major power, men who had spent their careers studying the balance of offensive and defensive capability sat with the reports from Belgium and understood that something fundamental had shifted. The fortress, that ancient, reliable institution of military geography, the fixed point around which strategy had organized itself for centuries, was no longer reliable. Given sufficient industrial capacity and sufficient engineering genius, any fixed position could be reduced, any wall could be brought down. The question was simply one of resources and time. Krupp had answered the question of resources, and time in a war that everyone still believed would be brief seemed abundant. It was not abundant. Nothing about the First World War turned out to be what anyone had expected it to be, and the early German advances that Big Bertha had helped enable stalled on the Marne, and the war that was supposed to end by Christmas became instead the war that seemed to have no end at all. The Western Front hardened into its terrible configuration. Two vast armies facing each other across a narrow strip of churned earth and barbed wire, neither able to advance, neither willing to retreat, both fed by the industrial machinery of their respective nations with a steady, grinding, almost mechanical patience that had more in common with manufacturing than with anything previously understood as warfare. And the Krupp factories fed the German side of this machinery with everything they had. The shells were the thing. More than the guns themselves, more than any single weapon, it was the shells that defined the industrial character of the First World War. The artillery bombardments that preceded the great offensives, the week-long, earth-shaking storms of high explosive that were supposed to cut the wire and destroy the machine gun nests and break the will of the defenders before the infantry went over the top, consumed ammunition at rates that would have seemed fantastical to any previous generation of military planners. A single major offensive might fire millions of shells. The logistics of producing, transporting, and delivering this quantity of explosives to the front was in itself one of the great organizational challenges of the war, a challenge that the Krupp factories, running their endless shifts in the perpetual artificial day of their furnace light, were central to meeting.
The workers felt the weight of all this in their bodies. The shifts were long, 12 hours, sometimes longer. The work was dangerous in the way that all heavy industrial work is dangerous, with the additional particular danger of working with materials intended to explode. Accidents happened. People were hurt and sometimes killed in ways that the factory's hospitals handled with the quiet efficiency of institutions that have learned to absorb a certain level of human cost as the normal condition of production. And as the war continued and the German labor supply contracted, as the men who might have worked the factory floors were instead standing in the mud of the Western Front or lying beneath it, the question of where the workers would come from became increasingly urgent, increasingly desperate, increasingly answered in ways that the pre-war Gustav Krupp, the careful administrator who had managed the workers' colonies with paternalistic pride, might have found difficult to entirely recognize as the same institution he had been running. Prisoners of war began appearing on the factory floors. Civilian workers from occupied territories, Belgium, France, Poland, were brought to Essen under conditions that ranged from the difficult to the genuinely coercive. The great Krupp machine, which had always required human fuel as surely as it required coal and iron ore, was finding new sources of that fuel in the human consequences of the war it was helping to sustain. This was not yet the systematic horror that the Second World War would bring. It was something more ambiguous, more typical of the First World War's particular moral texture, which was not the texture of deliberate genocide, but of institutional indifference, of systems that consumed people not out of hatred, but out of need, not with malice, but with the terrible, mundane efficiency of organizations that have learned to see human beings primarily as variables in a production equation. The distinction matters, and it also, in certain lights, does not matter at all. Gustav Krupp watched the war from Villa Hugel with the detached administrative concern of a man managing a crisis rather than experiencing one. He was in regular contact with the military high command, with the government, with the Kaiser himself. He received reports and issued directives and attended meetings where serious men in serious rooms made decisions that would shape the lives of millions of people who would never know their names. He was, by every external measure, a man at the center of things, powerful, connected, essential. And yet there is something in the accounts of those years, in the letters and the memoirs and the contemporary descriptions of Gustav Krupp, that suggests a man who was always slightly adjacent to the thing he was managing, always slightly behind the glass, administering the machinery of catastrophe with a professionalism so complete that it had perhaps crowded out the capacity to feel what the machinery was actually doing to the world. The war ground on. 1915 became 1916, became 1917. The shells kept coming, the furnaces kept burning. And in the mud of the Western Front, in the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front, in the waters of the Atlantic and the deserts of the Middle East, the weapons that Krupp had built were doing what weapons are built to do, with a thoroughness and an efficiency that the men who had designed them, sitting at their drawing boards in the warm engineering offices of the Essen complex, had every professional reason to be proud of. Then, in the autumn of 1918, it ended, not with victory, not with the clean, decisive conclusion that the Schlieffen Plan had promised and the first weeks of the war had seemed to be delivering. It ended with exhaustion, with the slow, grinding recognition that Germany could not sustain what it had begun, that the blockade had starved the civilian population to the edge of collapse, that the army was spent and the home front was broken and the Kaiser himself was gone, fled to the Netherlands in the gray November rain, while the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in a French forest. The furnaces in Essen went quiet for the first time in 4 years, and Gustav Krupp stood in the sudden silence of Villa Hugel and tried to understand what had happened to the world he thought he had been managing so carefully, and what it meant for the empire he was supposed to be protecting, and what came next in a Germany that had just lost everything it had spent a century building toward. The answer to that question was still forming, somewhere in the bitter, humiliated darkness of a defeated nation, still taking shape in the beer halls and the street corners and the desperate political conversations of a people who had been told they were winning right up until the moment they lost. The answer had a name, but no one knew it yet, and the furnaces, after their brief silence, began to breathe again. There is a particular kind of desperation that settles over a great institution when the world it was built for suddenly ceases to exist. It is not the sharp, clean desperation of a single crisis, not the kind that arrives with a bang and demands an immediate response. It is slower than that, and in many ways more corrosive. It seeps in through the cracks. It moves through the corridors of power and the offices of management and the long conference tables where serious men sit and look at numbers that no longer make the sense they used to make. It is the desperation of an organism that has lost its environment, that finds itself perfectly adapted to a world that has, without warning or apology, simply stopped being there. This was the condition of the Krupp Empire in the years that followed the First World War, and it was, in its way, the condition of Germany itself. The Treaty of Versailles arrived in 1919 with the particular cruelty of a document written by people who had won and wanted the winning to mean something permanent. Germany was to pay reparations of a scale that would cripple its economy for a generation. Its military was to be reduced to a token force, 100,000 men, no air force, no submarines, no tanks, and strictly limited artillery. The great industrial machine that had armed the Kaiser's armies was by the explicit terms of the treaty to be dismantled, repurposed, neutered. Krupp could still make steel. It could still make locomotives and bridges and the civilian infrastructure of a peacetime economy. But the guns, the thing that had made Krupp Krupp, the thing that had built the name into a synonym for industrial power, those were, at least officially, finished. Gustav Krupp accepted the terms with the carefully maintained composure of a man who has decided that survival requires patience. He oversaw the destruction of machinery that the Allied Control Commission demanded be eliminated. He received the inspectors who came to verify compliance with a politeness so complete it was almost indistinguishable from contempt. And while the inspectors were shown what they needed to see, other things were happening in other rooms, quieter rooms, rooms that were not on the inspection tour. The research continued, not openly, not in ways that could be easily documented and presented to an Allied inspector with their clipboard and their mandate, but the engineers did not stop thinking about guns simply because the treaty said they should. The drawings were made and stored carefully. The calculations were kept. The institutional knowledge that had taken a century to accumulate was preserved with the deliberate, patient care of people who were certain that the world will eventually want what they know how to make, and who intend to be ready when that moment arrives. Gustav also found other ways to keep the expertise alive. Krupp established relationships with manufacturers in other countries, Sweden, the Netherlands, Spain, where research and development could continue under different names and in different jurisdictions, beyond the reach of the Versailles inspectors. It was a careful, methodical program of institutional survival dressed up as international business cooperation, and it worked well enough to ensure that when Germany eventually began to rearm, Krupp would not be starting from nothing. But the Weimar years were difficult in ways that went beyond the treaty restrictions. The German economy in the early 1920s entered a spiral of inflation so severe that it passed beyond economics into something that felt more like a collective psychological wound. People carried money to buy bread in wheelbarrows. The savings of a lifetime dissolved in months. The middle class, the careful, industrious, order-loving German middle class that had believed in the systems and institutions of their society with a faith that was almost religious, found itself economically annihilated by forces it could not understand or control, and the experience left a residue of rage and humiliation and desperate longing for stability that would prove in a few more years to be extraordinarily useful to a certain kind of politician.
The Krupp factories kept running through all of this, but running lean. Reduced workforces, reduced production, the constant anxiety of an enterprise trying to sustain itself through a period when the thing it was best at making was the one thing it was not allowed to make. Gustav managed it with his characteristic steadiness, but the steadiness was increasingly that of a man holding something together through sheer force of administrative will, without any great confidence about what he was holding it together for. Then came the Great Depression of 1929, and whatever fragile stability the Weimar Republic had managed to construct in its middle years, the so-called Golden Twenties, that brief, vivid, creatively explosive period when Berlin felt like the most alive city in the world, came apart with a speed that left almost no one ready for what came next. Unemployment in Germany reached levels that had no precedent in the industrial age. Banks failed, businesses closed. The streets of German cities filled with men who had worked all their lives and had no work to go to, who had believed in a system that had visibly, catastrophically failed them. Into this landscape of despair and anger, the political extremes moved with the confidence of people who have been waiting for exactly this moment. The communists offered one vision of the future, the National Socialists offered another, and the National Socialists had Adolf Hitler. Gustav Krupp's initial response to Hitler was the response of a conservative industrialist, cautious, slightly disdainful, alert to the coarseness and the radicalism, but also not entirely uninterested in certain aspects of what was being proposed. The Nazi Party's fierce anti-communism was appealing to a man like Gustav, who had watched the Russian Revolution with the particular horror of someone who understands viscerally what it means for an established order to be swept away. The promise of national renewal, of restored German power and pride, of a strong state that would bring order to the chaos of Weimar politics, these things were appealing too, in the abstract, to an industrialist who had spent the last decade trying to run a great enterprise in conditions of perpetual instability. But the Nazis were radical. They were violent. They were, in ways that Gustav found professionally uncomfortable, unpredictable. And unpredictability is the thing that serious administrators fear most, because serious administrators are, above everything else, people who need to know what the rules are in order to work within them. Gustav Krupp did not support Hitler early. This is worth saying clearly, because the history of German industrialists and National Socialism is sometimes compressed into a simpler story than the evidence supports. In the elections of the early 1930s, the big industrial interests, Krupp among them, distributed their political donations with the careful pragmatism of people hedging their bets, supporting various conservative and nationalist parties without committing fully to any single one. Hitler was one option among several, not the inevitable choice of a business community that had decided, collectively and consciously, to back fascism. What changed everything was the morning of January 30th, 1933. The day Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the calculations of every major institution in the country shifted simultaneously. Not because anyone had decided that Hitler was right or good or trustworthy, but because he was now in power. And power, in the world that men like Gustav Krupp inhabited, was the fundamental reality around which everything else organized itself. You could have opinions about power. You could prefer a different configuration of it, but you could not ignore it, and you could not, if you wanted to survive, position yourself in direct opposition to it without very good reasons and very strong nerves. Gustav Krupp had neither the reasons nor the nerves for opposition. Within weeks of Hitler's appointment, Gustav found himself at a meeting of leading German industrialists where Hitler himself spoke, laying out his vision for Germany's economic recovery, his plans for infrastructure investment, his intentions regarding the military restrictions of Versailles. The speech was designed to reassure, to present the new chancellor as a man of order and purpose, a man with whom business could be done, a man whose radicalism would be channeled into national revival rather than social chaos. Gustav listened, and something in what he heard, the certainty, the vision of a rearmed and resurgent Germany, the implicit promise that the restrictions that had hamstrung Krupp for 14 years were about to be swept away, reached something in him. Not enthusiasm exactly, something more professional than enthusiasm. The recognition of an opportunity, the sense that the environment in which the Krupp enterprise operated was about to change in ways that were, from the perspective of the business, almost entirely favorable. He left the meeting a different man than he had arrived, not converted, not ideologically committed, but aligned, quietly, carefully, professionally aligned with the new reality of German power. And the furnaces, sensing what was coming the way furnaces always seem to sense it, through the orders that begin to arrive, through the budgets that begin to expand, through the quiet multiplication of military contracts that appear in the production schedules like the first signs of a season changing, began, almost imperceptibly at first, to burn a little brighter.
There is a word that appears again and again in the documents and testimonies of people who participated in the rearmament of Germany in the 1930s. The word is gradually. Things happened gradually. The restrictions loosened gradually. The military contracts increased gradually. The moral boundaries that might once have given pause were crossed gradually.
Each small step made more acceptable by the step that had preceded it, each compromise rendered reasonable by the compromise that had come before. This is how large institutions travel from one moral universe to another without ever quite feeling the moment of crossing, not in a single dramatic leap, but in a long, quiet series of small steps, each one defensible in isolation, none of them defensible in sum. The rearmament of Germany began almost immediately after Hitler took power, though it began in the shadows, carefully concealed from the international community that was supposed to be monitoring Germany's compliance with the Versailles restrictions. The Krupp factories, with their long experience of maintaining capability beneath the surface of apparent compliance, were ideally positioned for this kind of work. The drawings that had been kept, the engineers whose expertise had been preserved through the lean years, the relationships with foreign manufacturers who had served as cover for continued research and development, all of it now became suddenly enormously valuable. The contracts arrived at the Krupp offices with the quiet urgency of things that had been waiting a long time to happen. Artillery pieces that had existed only on paper began to move from the drawing board to the production floor. Tank components, Germany was building an armored force that the Versailles Treaty explicitly prohibited, began appearing in Krupp's manufacturing schedules under civilian cover designations that fooled almost no one who was paying attention and were not really intended to. The rearmament was an open secret by the mid-1930s, conducted with a brazenness that reflected Hitler's correct calculation that the Western powers were too exhausted and too frightened of another war to enforce the treaty they had written. Gustav Krupp moved through this period with something that looked increasingly like enthusiasm. This surprised some observers who had known him as a cautious, conservative administrator, a man of process rather than passion. But the rearmament was not asking Gustav to be passionate, it was asking him to be competent. And competence applied to the thing that Krupp had always been best at, in conditions of essentially unlimited military funding and political backing at the highest levels of the state, produced in Gustav something that functioned very much like joy. The factory was doing what it was built to do. The empire was expanding again. The name Krupp was, once more, synonymous with military power of the first order. He became in these years one of Hitler's most useful and most visible industrial supporters. He led the Reich Association of German Industry, the principal organization of German business, and used that position to bring the industrial community into alignment with the Nazi regime, with a thoroughness and efficiency that the regime itself could not have achieved without him. He organized the flow of business donations to the Nazi Party. He oversaw the Aryanization of Jewish-owned businesses, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned enterprises to non-Jewish German owners as an institutional policy, embedding it in the structures of German industry with the same administrative precision he brought to everything else. He did not, in any document or testimony that has survived, express moral discomfort about any of this. This is perhaps the most important thing to sit with in the quiet of this hour. Not the dramatic evil, not the guns and the shells and the preparation for war, but the administrative evil. The evil of a man who was, by most accounts, neither hateful nor cruel in any personally expressive way, who did not shout or rage or celebrate suffering, who simply administered a system whose moral content he had chosen carefully and deliberately not to examine, who signed the documents and attended the meetings and oversaw the processes and went home to Villa Hugel and sat in his enormous, slightly joyless rooms and did not, apparently, lie awake. The guns that Krupp produced in these years were extraordinary by any technical measure. The artillery pieces that would support the German invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union were the products of the finest military engineering in the world, refined through decades of research and manufactured with a precision and reliability that made them, in purely professional terms, masterpieces. The engineers who designed them took pride in their work. The workers who built them took pride in their work. The institution that produced them took pride in its work. And the work was, by the standards of the thing it was intended to do, excellent. This is another thing that history asks us to sit with: the excellence, the craft.
the genuine human skill and dedication that went into building instruments of mass destruction. Because it is easy to imagine that evil is always shoddy, always careless, always evidently wrong in its details as well as its intentions. But the Krupp guns were not shoddy. They were magnificent, and the magnificence is part of the horror, not separate from it. By 1935, Hitler felt confident enough to announce publicly what everyone already knew, that Germany was rearming, that the Versailles restrictions were being abandoned, that the German military would be rebuilt to whatever national security required. The announcement was met with protests from Britain and France that were firm in language and empty in consequence, and Hitler drew the correct conclusion from the emptiness. He could go further. He could always go further. The Western powers were not going to stop him.
The Krupp factories responded to the public announcement of rearmament the way a river responds to a dam being removed, with a sudden, powerful surge of everything that had been building up behind the restriction. Production expanded dramatically. The workforce grew. New facilities were built. The range of weapons being produced broadened to include not just artillery, but armor plate for the new tanks, naval guns for the expanding fleet, components for the Luftwaffe's aircraft that were being assembled in factories across Germany. Krupp was not the only arms manufacturer in Germany, but it was the largest, the oldest, the most technically capable, and in many ways the most symbolically important. The name that meant to the German military establishment that a weapon had been made properly. Gustav Krupp's health began to decline in the late 1930s. He suffered a series of strokes that progressively diminished his capacity for the kind of focused administrative engagement that had always been his greatest strength. By the time the Second World War began in September 1939, when German tanks rolled into Poland and the long, terrible sequence of European catastrophe began again, barely 20 years after the last one had ended, Gustav was increasingly incapacitated, present in name and position, but no longer fully capable of managing what his name and position required. The management of the Krupp Empire in the war years fell increasingly to his son, his eldest son, a young man who had grown up in Villa Hugel, who had studied law and business, who had been prepared since childhood for the weight of the name he carried, and who was now, in the worst possible circumstances, being asked to carry it into the worst possible war. His name was Alfred, and the decisions that Alfred Krupp made in the years that followed, the decisions about labor and production, and the particular human cost of keeping the great machine running when the normal sources of labor had been consumed by the war, would define not just his own fate, but the final chapter of the dynasty his family had built over more than a century of fire and steel. The war was in its early years still a war of movement, of the sudden, shocking German advances that the world watched with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Poland in weeks, France in months, the Low Countries, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, falling one after another before a military machine whose effectiveness reflected, in part, the quality of the weapons that Krupp had spent the 1930s building for it. The Wehrmacht moved across Europe with Krupp steel in its guns and Krupp steel on its tanks, and the world that had been so carefully ordered by the Versailles Treaty came apart with a speed that left the architects of that order stunned and scrambling. And in Essen, the factories burned. The furnaces glowed against the night sky with a light that the people of the Ruhr Valley had grown up seeing as the normal condition of darkness, a warmth that meant work, that meant wages, that meant the great machine was still running and the world still had a place for them in it. They did not know, most of them, what was coming, what the war's expansion would eventually require, what the logic of total war applied to an industrial empire already stretched to its limits would eventually produce in those same factory halls where they had spent their working lives. But the logic was already moving, quietly, inexorably, with the terrible patience of systems that have found their direction and will not be deflected, moving towards something that even the darkest imagination of 1939 could not yet fully picture, moving toward the slave labor camps that would eventually place tens of thousands of human beings, concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, civilians dragged from the occupied territories of Eastern Europe inside the walls of the Krupp Empire.
moving toward the thing that would transform the name Krupp into a symbol of industrial genius, into something that carried permanently and irrevocably the weight of a crime. The night was deepening over Europe. The fires of the furnaces burned on, and somewhere in the administrative machinery of the Reich, in the offices where human beings were categorized and allocated and assigned like components in a production schedule, the paperwork that would bring the darkness fully inside the gates of the Krupp Empire was already being prepared. The devil's bargain, struck so quietly in the early days of 1933, was about to present its full accounting. And the price was going to be paid by people who had never signed anything at all.
There is a kind of silence that exists inside very loud places. You find it sometimes in factories, in the brief pause between the fall of a great hammer and the echo that follows, in the half-second of held breath before the furnace roars back to life. It is not a peaceful silence. It is a silence that is aware of itself, that knows what surrounds it, that carries in its brief existence the full weight of everything that came before and everything that is about to come after. It is the silence of something that cannot stop, that will not stop, that has long since passed the point where stopping was a choice anyone inside it felt able to make. This was the silence at the heart of the Krupp Empire in the years between 1942 and 1945. The factories were louder than they had ever been. More workers, more shifts, more production, the furnaces burning with an intensity that seemed to push against the physical limits of what metal and fire could sustain. And yet inside all that noise, inside the relentless mechanical thunder of the greatest armaments complex in the world, at the height of the most destructive war in human history, there was this silence. The silence of things that were happening and not being spoken about. The silence of suffering that had been rendered by institutional habit and deliberate design invisible. Alfred Krupp had assumed effective control of the empire gradually, stepping into the space left by his father's declining health with the careful, measured confidence of a man who has been prepared for this moment since childhood. He was 30 years old when the war began. He was lean and precise and somewhat cold in the way that people are cold when they have learned to manage their emotions rather than feel them, when the cultivation of personal control has become so complete that warmth, when it appears, seems like a brief technical malfunction rather than a natural state. He was also, by any honest assessment, extremely capable. He understood the business at a technical level that his father had never quite matched, the engineering, the metallurgy, the production processes that turned raw materials into weapons with the elegant efficiency of a system that has been refined over decades. He moved through the factory floors with the ease of a man who knows what he is looking at, who can read a production line the way a musician reads a score, who finds in the machinery of industry a language that speaks to him more directly than any other. And it was precisely this capability, this deep, genuine competence that made the decisions of the war years so impossible to separate from him. Because the decisions that were made in the Krupp enterprise between 1942 and 1945 were not the decisions of a man who did not understand his business. They were the decisions of a man who understood it completely, and who made choices within that understanding that placed the production of weapons above every other consideration, including the most basic claims of human dignity and human life. The labor shortage had been building for years. The war consumed men, German men, the normal workforce of the factories, with an appetite that the most optimistic production planners had not fully anticipated. The drafts took workers from the factory floors and sent them east to the enormous grinding front in the Soviet Union that was swallowing the German army in quantities that made the losses of the First World War look, by comparison, almost manageable. The factories needed workers. The war needed soldiers. The two needs were in direct, irresolvable competition. The Nazi regime's solution to this competition was one of the defining institutional characteristics of the Third Reich, the use of forced labor on a scale that had no precedent in the industrial age. Prisoners of war,
particularly Soviet prisoners, who were treated by the Nazi regime with a contempt that reflected the racial ideology at the heart of National Socialism. Civilian workers from occupied territories, Poland, Ukraine, France, the Netherlands, brought to Germany under conditions that ranged from nominally voluntary to explicitly coerced. And, as the war continued and the regime's machinery of persecution intensified, concentration camp prisoners, men and women and children who had been stripped of every legal protection and every human right and who were available to German industry at a cost that was, in the accounting systems of the Reich, essentially nothing. Krupp used all of these categories of labor. This is not a matter of historical dispute. The documentary record is extensive. The contracts with the SS for the provision of concentration camp labor, the internal memoranda discussing the management of forced workers, the production reports that tracked their output with the same bureaucratic precision applied to every other input in the manufacturing process. The Krupp enterprise in the years between 1942 and 1945 was sustained in significant part by the forced labor of tens of thousands of human beings who had no choice about being there and no power to leave. The conditions in which these workers lived varied, but the range ran from terrible to something that can only be described as deliberately murderous. Forced laborers in the Krupp facilities received rations calculated not for sustenance, but for the minimum caloric input required to maintain a certain level of productive output, rations that over time produced a kind of slow starvation, a gradual diminishment of the body that was reflected in the declining productivity numbers that appeared in the production reports alongside everything else. They lived in camps adjacent to or within the factory complexes, in conditions of overcrowding and inadequate sanitation that produced disease with the reliable efficiency of systems designed without regard for human welfare.
When the Allied bombing campaigns intensified and the great factory complexes of the Ruhr Valley began to be hit with increasing accuracy and increasing destructive force, the forced laborers were among the most exposed. Shelters that existed for German workers were frequently not made available to the forced labor population. The legal and moral framework that governed the treatment of prisoners of war and civilian forced workers under international law was, in practice, set aside. Not through any single dramatic decision, but through the same gradual accumulation of small administrative choices that had characterized the Krupp enterprise's accommodation of the Nazi regime from the beginning. Alfred knew. This is the finding that the post-war legal proceedings would establish, carefully and with extensive documentation. He was not a distant figure, insulated from operational reality by layers of management. He walked the factory floors, he read the production reports, he attended the meetings where labor allocation was discussed, he signed the documents. The knowledge of what was happening inside the empire he controlled was not hidden from him by subordinates trying to protect him from uncomfortable truths. It was present in the normal administrative flow of information that a man of his capability and his engagement with the business would inevitably have received and processed. He processed it as a production problem. He addressed the conditions of forced laborers when those conditions threatened to reduce productive output below acceptable levels. He did not address them when they did not. This is the thing that the documents show, with a clarity that is almost unbearable in its ordinariness. Not sadism, not the pleasure of cruelty for its own sake, but the reduction of human suffering to a variable in a production equation. Present in the reports, acknowledged in the meetings, managed with the same professional attention given to any other factor affecting output. The suffering was real, it was known, and it was, within the institutional logic of the Krupp enterprise at war, simply one of many things to be managed. Outside the factory walls, the war was turning. Slowly at first, in ways that the German High Command tried to explain away and the German public tried not to notice. Then more obviously, more irrevocably,
as the Soviet counteroffensives pushed the Wehrmacht back from the enormous territorial gains of the early years, as the Allied landings in North Africa and then Italy opened new fronts that the overstretched German military could not adequately respond to, as the bombing campaigns over Germany intensified until the great industrial cities of the Ruhr were lit at night not by furnace glow, but by the fires of buildings that would not be rebuilt. Essen was bombed repeatedly. The Krupp facilities, enormous, sprawling, impossible to fully conceal from the navigators of the Allied bomber streams, were hit again and again. The factory buildings that Alfred had constructed, that Fritz had expanded, that Gustav had modernized and Alfred was now running at the absolute limits of their capacity, took damage that the repair crews worked around the clock to fix, the production resuming in the gaps between raids with a stubborn, exhausted persistence that said everything about the institutional character of an enterprise that had been told at the very highest levels of the state that it was essential to the survival of Germany and must not stop. It stopped anyway, not because of the bombing in the end, though the bombing did enormous damage. It stopped because Germany itself stopped, because the logic of a war that could not be won finally, after years of enormous human cost on every side, reached its conclusion in the rubble of Berlin in the spring of 1945, and the Third Reich that had remade the Krupp Empire in its own image ceased to exist. The forced laborers who had survived walked out of the camps beside the ruined factories into a world that was trying, with enormous difficulty, to understand what had happened to it and what it was supposed to do next. And Alfred Krupp, in the sudden silence of a Germany that had lost everything, waited for what was coming.
The autumn of 1945 had a particular quality to it in Germany. A quality that survivors described in ways that kept returning to the same images. Gray, still, the smell of dust and old fires. Cities that had been reduced to landscapes of broken stone and exposed foundations, where the streets could still be traced by the lines of rubble on either side, but the buildings themselves were gone, open to the sky like rooms in a dream where all the walls have been removed and you are left standing in the middle of what used to be your life, trying to remember what the furniture looked like. It was, by every account, a world that felt posthumous, a world that had died and had not yet figured out what it was going to be instead. Into this world came the Nuremberg trials. Not immediately. The legal machinery required months to assemble, the evidence to be gathered and organized, the jurisdictional questions to be resolved, the fundamental philosophical problem of prosecuting crimes for which no adequate legal framework had previously existed, to be addressed with enough rigor that the proceedings could not be dismissed as mere victor's justice. But by the autumn of 1945, the International Military Tribunal was sitting in the one Nuremberg courtroom that had survived the bombing largely intact, and the great reckoning that the survivors of the Nazi regime's crimes had been waiting for was underway. The original plan had been to try Gustav Krupp alongside the other major figures of the Nazi regime. He was on the initial indictment, listed among the architects and enablers of the catastrophe, to be held accountable for the role that the Krupp Empire had played in arming and sustaining the Third Reich. But Gustav Krupp was, by 1945, no longer the man who had made those decisions. The strokes of the late 1930s had continued their work, and by the time the tribunal convened, he was a diminished, confused old man who could not follow the proceedings, could not meaningfully participate in his own defense, could not, in any honest assessment, be said to be fully present in the courtroom in the way that justice requires of the person it is judging. The tribunal found him unfit to stand trial. He was severed from the proceedings and sent back to the estate where he would spend the remaining years of his life in the fog of his diminishment, dying in 1950 without ever having accounted in any formal legal sense for what had been built and done in his name. Some felt this was justice evaded.
Others felt it was justice arriving at its own pace, in its own form, that a man reduced to that condition had already been sentenced by something more fundamental than any court. History has not entirely settled the question, and perhaps it should not. The ambiguity is part of the truth. Alfred was tried instead. In what became known as the Krupp trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials conducted by American military tribunals after the conclusion of the main international proceedings, Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach sat in the dock and heard the charges read against him with the same controlled, slightly distant composure that seemed to be his natural register for all experiences, pleasant and unpleasant alike. He was charged with crimes against humanity and the plunder of occupied territories. The evidence against him was substantial. The documents, the testimony of survivors, the production records that his own enterprise had maintained with such meticulous administrative care and which now served as their own accusation. The courtroom in which Alfred was tried was a different kind of room from the factory floors he had spent his life moving through. It was a room where the logic that had governed his decisions, the logic of production, of output, of institutional necessity, was not the operating language. The operating language was that of human rights and human dignity, the language of a legal and moral framework that insisted, with the particular insistence of something that has been violated and must be reasserted, that there are things you cannot do to human beings regardless of what the institutional requirements of the moment appeared to demand. Alfred's defense argued that he had operated within the systems and structures of the Nazi state, that the use of forced labor was a state policy, not a Krupp initiative, that the enterprise had done what the regime required of all major industries, that personal criminal responsibility could not be fairly attached to a man who had been, in this reading, an administrator of conditions he had not created and could not have changed. The tribunal did not accept this argument. In July 1948, Alfred Krupp was found guilty of crimes against humanity for the employment of forced labor under inhumane conditions and guilty of plunder for the seizure of industrial enterprises in occupied territories. He was sentenced to 12 years' imprisonment and the forfeiture of all his personal property, the factories, the estates, the accumulated assets of a dynasty that had been building for more than a century. He was 41 years old. He had inherited the world and been told he must give it back. He served 3 years. In 1951, John J. McCloy, the American High Commissioner for Germany, granted Alfred Krupp a clemency that remains, more than 7 decades later, one of the most controversial decisions of the post-war period. The Cold War had changed the strategic calculations of the Western powers with extraordinary speed. Germany, which in 1945 had been a defeated enemy to be punished and contained, had by 1951 become a potential ally to be rebuilt and incorporated into the Western defensive architecture against the Soviet Union. The economic recovery of West Germany was, from the American perspective, a strategic priority. And the Krupp enterprise, with its industrial capacity and its technical expertise, was, from the same perspective, a significant component of that recovery. McCloy released Alfred and restored his property. The justification offered was procedural and legal, questions about the validity of certain aspects of the original proceedings, concerns about the fairness of specific elements of the trial. But the timing and the context made the political calculation unmistakable to anyone who was paying attention, and many people were paying attention, and many of them were not satisfied with what they saw. The survivors of the Krupp forced labor camps were not satisfied. The Jewish organizations that had documented the crimes and advocated for accountability were not satisfied. The journalists and lawyers and ordinary citizens of multiple countries who had believed that Nuremberg represented a genuine and permanent commitment to holding power accountable for crimes against humanity were not satisfied. They said so, loudly and at length, and the controversy surrounded the clemency decision like smoke, persistent,
difficult to disperse, carrying in it the smell of something that had been allowed to smolder when it should have been fully extinguished. Alfred Krupp walked out of Landsberg prison in February 1951 and was met by a crowd of Krupp managers and employees who greeted him with the particular warmth of an institution welcoming back its natural leader. He returned to Essen. He returned to Villa Hugel, the great joyless mansion that Alfred had built on his hill above the city, that had stood through the bombing and the defeat and the occupation and the trials as a monument to the durability of certain kinds of power. He resumed control of the enterprise with a speed and efficiency that suggested either remarkable resilience or remarkable compartmentalization, perhaps both. The 1950s were, for Alfred Krupp, a period of extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable success. The West German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, that astonishing recovery of a devastated economy that became one of the defining stories of the post-war era, lifted the Krupp enterprise along with everything else. Steel was needed. Industrial capacity was needed. The infrastructure of a rebuilt Germany required exactly what Krupp had always made best, and the orders came in, and the factories hummed, and the name Krupp appeared again in the financial press and the business journals as a synonym for industrial power restored. But the name also appeared in other places, in the testimonies of survivors that continued to be published and read, in the historical research that was beginning, slowly and against considerable institutional resistance, to document what had happened inside the factories and camps of the Nazi industrial complex, in the conversations of people who had been there, who had worked alongside the forced laborers, who had seen the conditions, who carried in their memories images that the post-war economic recovery could not entirely paper over. Alfred gave interviews in these years that are remarkable documents of a particular kind of moral architecture. He discussed the business with evident satisfaction and genuine expertise. He discussed the war years with a careful vagueness, acknowledging that forced labor had been used, declining to engage with the human reality of what that had meant, retreating behind the language of institutional necessity and state compulsion that his defense had deployed at Nuremberg and that he had, apparently, continued to find persuasive in the years since. He did not, in any interview or document that has survived, express what most people would recognize as genuine remorse, something more formal, more managed, an acknowledgement of historical fact that carefully avoided the emotional engagement that acknowledgement of that particular fact would seem to require. Whether this represented a failure of conscience or an excess of control, whether Alfred Krupp was a man who had no remorse or a man who had learned so completely to manage his inner life that remorse, if it existed, could not find its way to the surface, is a question that the historical record cannot definitively answer. What the record does show is that in 1959, under significant pressure from Jewish organizations and the West German government, Alfred Krupp agreed to establish a fund for the compensation of former forced laborers who had worked in Krupp facilities during the war. The fund, initially set to 31.5 million Deutschmarks, was a significant sum and a significant acknowledgement, the first time a major German industrial enterprise had formally accepted financial responsibility for the use of forced labor. It was also, by any honest accounting, insufficient. The number of people who had suffered in Krupp facilities, the duration of that suffering, the physical and psychological damage that had been done, none of it could be adequately addressed by any financial calculation. Compensation of this kind is really not about money. It is about acknowledgement, about the formal institutional recognition that something was done, that it was wrong, that the people it was done to deserve that wrongness named and owned. The fund represented, in this sense, a partial and complicated step towards something, not full accountability, but something in that direction. The survivors who received payments from the fund had by that point been waiting for 14 years. Many others had not survived to wait at all. The final chapter of Alfred Krupp's personal story arrived with a quietness that seemed almost incongruous given the scale of everything that had preceded it.
His marriage to a woman named Vera Hossenfeld ended in an expensive and contentious divorce in 1957. He had one son, Arndt, who showed no interest in or aptitude for the management of an industrial empire, and who would eventually, in a decision that said something profound about the exhaustion of a dynasty that had been carrying its name for too long, renounce his inheritance entirely in exchange for a generous annual allowance, choosing comfort and anonymity over the weight of what the name Krupp had come to mean. Alfred's health declined through the mid-1960s. The enterprise he had rebuilt with such focused, relentless competence was facing the structural challenges of a steel industry in transition, the same global economic forces that were reshaping heavy industry across the Western world, making the old model of the integrated family-controlled industrial dynasty increasingly difficult to sustain against the competition of international markets and the demands of modern corporate governance.
He died on July 30th, 1967. The date was, with the particular irony that history occasionally permits itself, his birthday. He was 59 years old. He died in Villa Hugel, in the house his great-great-grandfather had built, surrounded by the accumulated weight of a name that had meant, across its long history, so many things. Ingenuity and ambition and industrial genius and paternalism and accommodation and complicity and crime and survival and the particular, complicated, never fully resolved question of what it means to build something extraordinary on a foundation that includes, somewhere in its depth, an enormous darkness. The Krupp enterprise did not die with him. It continued, reorganized, restructured, eventually merged with Thyssen to become ThyssenKrupp, one of the largest steel and industrial conglomerates in the world. The name persists. The factories persist in altered form. The work goes on. But the dynasty, the thing that Alfred had built from nothing, that Fritz had expanded with his gentle, slightly lost intelligence, that Gustav had administered with his careful, enclosed competence, that Alfred had rebuilt from the ruins of defeat with his cold, extraordinary capability, that was finished. Arndt's renunciation was the final chapter of the family story, written in the language of refusal, of a young man looking at the name he had been given and deciding with a clarity that perhaps only someone raised inside its shadow could achieve, that he did not want it. Villa Hugel stands today as a museum and cultural center. You can walk through its rooms now, the enormous, slightly joyless rooms that Alfred built, that 4 generations of Krupps moved through with varying degrees of comfort and belonging. The rooms are beautiful in the way that very large, very serious rooms are beautiful, impressive rather than warm, grand rather than inviting. The furniture is museum furniture now, arranged for viewing rather than living. The light falls through the windows at the same angles it always did, touching the same surfaces, illuminating the same architectural decisions made by a man who wanted to show the world what he had become. Outside, through the windows that look down toward Essen, the city continues its life. The steel industry that once defined it has largely moved on, and the Ruhr Valley has spent the decades since Alfred's death in the complicated, necessary work of reinventing itself, finding new purposes for old landscapes, new identities for places whose entire self-understanding was built around industries that no longer exist in the same form. It is work that Germany as a whole has done, with varying success and varying honesty, in the long aftermath of the war, and the crimes, and the reckoning that never quite fully came. The furnaces have gone cold. The hammers are still. The particular sound that the people of Essen once described in their letters, that layered, persistent, all-surrounding industrial music of a factory complex running at full capacity, has faded into the kind of memory that exists only in the oldest inhabitants, in the archives, in the documents that historians read in quiet rooms and try to understand. What remains is the name, carved in stone above doorways, printed in history books, carried in the memories of survivors and the research of scholars and the testimony of witnesses who understood, from the inside, what it meant for a great industrial dynasty to place the logic of production above the claims of humanity,
and to discover, in the long, slow aftermath of that choice, that the accounting always comes. That history is patient in a way that institutions are not. That the furnaces go cold and the hammers go still, and the money moves on to other names and other enterprises, but the record remains, patient, permanent, available to anyone willing to read it by whatever light the present offers. The Krupp Dynasty is over. The story is not.
It lives in the questions it leaves behind, about industry and responsibility, about the relationship between great institutions and the states they serve, about the ordinary logic of ordinary people inside extraordinary systems, about what it costs to build something magnificent and what it costs to keep it running when the price of running it rises beyond what conscience can honestly pay. It lives in the faces of the people who were inside those factory walls and whose suffering was recorded in the same meticulous administrative documents that recorded the production numbers and the delivery schedules and the quarterly reports of an enterprise that never stopped for a single day, being primarily concerned with its own continuity. And it lives here, in this quiet telling, in the space between your waking mind and the sleep that is coming, in the understanding that history is not something that happened to other people in another time. It is the accumulated weight of human choices, made by people who were, in most of the ways that matter, not so different from us, who wanted security and success and the satisfaction of work done well, who told themselves the stories that their situations required them to tell, who followed the logic of their institutions until the logic led somewhere that logic alone could not justify. The night is deep now. The story has been told. And somewhere in the soft, reflective space that opens between the last word and the first dream, perhaps there is room for one quiet thought to settle, not as judgment, not as condemnation, but as the kind of understanding that only comes when the defenses are down and the mind is open, and the long, complicated truth of human history is allowed to simply be what it is. We are all, in some measure, inside institutions larger than ourselves. We all follow logics that were established before we arrived. We all make small choices that accumulate over time into something we might not have chosen if we could have seen it whole at the beginning. The question that the Krupp Dynasty leaves behind is not simply what they did. It is what we would do. What we do. What the small, daily choices of ordinary people inside powerful systems add up to when the accounting is finally made and the furnaces have gone cold and the only thing left is the record. Sleep now. Let the weight of it settle gently, the way all important things settle, not crushing, but present. A quiet reminder carried into the night that the past is always closer than it seems, that the stones of Villa Hugel still stand on their hill above Essen, and the light still falls through those enormous windows, and the rooms are still there, waiting with the patient silence of places that have seen everything and forgotten nothing. The fire has gone out. The story remains. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. This concludes the Krupp Dynasty, weapons that fueled fascism. Thank you for listening. If these words carried you gently through the night, if the quiet weight of history has become something you find comfort in exploring, then let this channel stay beside you. There are more stories waiting. Long, soft, cinematic journeys through the moments and the people that shaped the world you woke up in. Subscribe if you are so inclined. The next story will be here when the night comes again. Sleep well.